Some years ago, I lived in northern Maine. Sometimes that fact comes up in conversation, and people who know the state asked if I lived in Presque Isle, or maybe Caribou. It's still satisfying to say no, I lived up near Fort Kent. People who know Maine gasp, because Fort Kent sits literally at the edge of the American map, at the very northern cap of the state. My house was 7 miles south of Fort Kent, and it stood high enough on a hill that I could see across those 7 miles, see the pall of smoke from Fort Kent's wood stoves in winter, see the hills of Canada beyond. The house had been built just after the American Civil War, but there was nothing fancy about it, nothing of the New England classicism that is common farther south. With a square floor plan and 2 stories under a peaked roof, it had been sided sometime around 1950 with a then-popular asbestos tile, light green and brittle. The tile was no longer available, and several pieces had broken over the years, revealing shiny foil that could not be properly covered. On the west side of the house, there was an unheated sun porch. It had been built 2 generations earlier for a tubercular child who had not survived. In summer, the porch was often unpleasantly warm, and in winter it was so cold that we used it only as a place to pile coats and boots. There was another lean-to on the north side of the house. It had been added for a kitchen and a bath, the first plumbed rooms in the structure. This northern addition was insulated and heated, but it didn't have a proper foundation. It sat on poles resting on massive slabs of slate. And the floors tilted so much that if you spilled a glass of water, the water ran straight into the baseboards. Still, the house was wonderful. The green tile and foil covered cedar shingles, and the shingles covered 4 by 10 planks. The planks were stacked on their thin sides, and they had been dovetailed and pegged together into amazingly solid walls. You couldn't see the planks, they were covered up. But if you slammed the solid front door, a tiny tremor ran through the house and the whole structure responded as a rigid mass. The house no longer exists. It was knocked down and burned a couple of years ago. But people who were there say that when the bulldozer first rammed the house, nothing happened. When the bulldozer came again, harder, the whole original house, 4 rooms square, upper and lower, moved off its boulder foundations, and only then, as a block teetering over the cellar, began to come apart. I had rented the house from a farmer named Orney. His great-great-grandfather had built it, and Orney himself would never have moved out, but after raising 6 children in it, his wife Elsie decided she wanted a house of her own, wanted nothing more to do with this house of her husband's family. No hard feelings, at least toward Orney. The house just reminded her of too many years spent with a mother-in-law. And so Orney and their 4 sons built a new house 100 yards up the road. This new house was well built and much more comfortable than the old one. I think, as I say that, of getting into a hot bath in winter and reaching a finger up to touch the thick ice that had built up around the corners of the panes in the bathroom window. But the new house had been built to plans that might have come from the catalog store in town, and even though it was built of lumber sawn from logs cut on the surrounding hills, it looked like 1,000,000 suburban homes. Fortunately, between my house and the new house, there was a very large barn, approximately as old as the house I was in. The barn was covered with a homely siding, the color of peppered straw. I liked its plainness, which masked more hand-sawn timbers. A few weeks before arriving for the first time in Fort Kent, I had been living, jobless, on the edge of Washington State's Olympic Peninsula. The counselor at the Port Angeles Unemployment Insurance Office told me that he didn't have a lot of openings for geographers. My wife Margaret and I had stopped at a tiny post office on our way to picking berries, and she had broken into tears when she saw the mailgram that had just come from me offering a job in Fort Kent. We had only been in Washington about a month, and another move was the last thing she wanted. A few days later, I began driving a loaded rental van across the country. I crossed the blistering heat of the Columbia Basin. I went through the North Dakota Badlands. At Sault Ste. Marie, I crossed into Canada for the run down to Ottawa and Quebec City. Oddly enough, the first French I saw came long before Quebec. It was somewhere in Western Ontario. There was a blocked-up van, something like a decommissioned hokey-pokey wagon, and on it there was a sign that advertised French fries. I remember thinking how excellent they were, thicker than the American standard, like honest pieces of potato. I didn't think at the time how appropriate an introduction they were to Fort Kent. I came down to Quebec City and the inlet of the St. Lawrence. Everything was French now, including, of course, the names of the places I passed: La Pocatière, Kamouraska, and Rivière-du-Loup, the town where I left the St. Lawrence. The Trans-Canada Highway here crosses the low but broad summit of the Appalachians. It comes down past the Great Lake Temiscouata, which empties into the St. John River at Edmundston. This was New Brunswick. Despite the English name, the language of the northern half of this province remains overwhelmingly French. So, too, French was the language of Madawaska on the American side of the river. French was the dominant language 20 miles upstream, too, at Fort Kent. Sitting at the counter of the coffee shop attached to Fort Kent's one motel, almost the only word I recognized was the occasional toast. But even fluent French speakers are baffled, at least for a while, by the Acadian dialect spoken in the St. John Valley. When I heard, after some days of unsuccessful and increasingly worried house hunting, that an old farmhouse was for rent 7 miles south of town, I drove out in my loaded van. I had been given instructions about going to the new house, where I was told the owners lived. Now I worried that conversation might be impossible. Elsie answered, on the short side, shy, friendly. I remember best her nervous energy, a trace of the not altogether healthy nervousness so common among women in the St. John Valley. Her English had a slight French accent, but Elsie had gone to an English-language high school, and we had no difficulty understanding each other. The old house was for rent, she said, but her husband was out. She would speak to him in the morning. I could return the next day. That was it. The next day I knocked. Orny answered. He was maybe an inch below 6 feet, round-faced and round-shouldered, a powerful man, but without the muscle definition that we have almost come to demand of strong men. He had only been through 3rd grade, and he had a hard time reading or writing English. Still, we got along at once, mostly because he was so much at home that he saw no reason not to trust a stranger at the door. We agreed on $100 a month, and I shook his hand. His fingers were twice as thick as mine, and soft, padded. Margaret had stayed behind on the West Coast for an extra week. Now she was driving her way across in our old Dodge. I still had the rental van, though I had unloaded it into the house. When she arrived in Fort Kent, I told her to follow me. I turned off the state highway and began driving along a farm road that climbed long, gentle hills topped with forest, but planted along the road with great fields of equally green potatoes. In the rearview mirror of the truck, I apprehensively searched her face for signs that she might be unhappy. There were none. From half a mile off, she says, she spied the place, and that was that. For the 5 years we lived in it, she never complained about the chipped siding or the icy bathroom window. Orny kept a few steers on a steep hillside pasture next to the old barn, and each fall he shot and butchered 1 or 2 for his freezer and ours. He hated doing it, and I never watched, but Margaret, without fail, would go out to the barn where the carcass was hanging. A dog or two circled the blood and offal. Orny explained to her what he was doing and why he had to be careful, for example, about cutting around the gallbladder. Margaret retrieved the heart and liver and kidneys, which Elsie would have nothing to do with. Into our freezer they went. Not content with this, Margaret once struggled into the house carrying an entire hide, still wet. We hung it in the basement and set to work scraping. Orny, who so far as I can remember never laughed at anyone, could not help smiling. The next spring I threw the thing away. It was not scraped clean enough for tanning. I can still see patches of the incredibly tough membrane that defeated us. Our neighbors, including Orny, there were 5 families within about a quarter mile of the house, never felt isolated. Indeed, when, after 5 years, we finally left Maine, they were genuinely puzzled and perhaps even hurt that we could do such a thing. But from the beginning, we left Maine several times a year for a week in Quebec City or Montreal. More often, I suppose, we went south to Bangor or Portland or points beyond. We quickly learned that there were 2 ways to go south, the safe way and the risky way. The safe way was through Caribou, Presque Isle, and Holton, which is a mile or 2 from the northern end of Interstate 95. In theory, this should have been a beautiful drive because it crosses the heart of Aroostook County's potato area, which stretches from Caribou south to about Holton. Up in Fort Kent, we were in an outlier, a patch of arable land sheathing the St. John. The trouble with this safe route was that it was civilized. There were houses everywhere from Caribou on south. Worse, there was traffic, including lines of semis full of bagged potatoes. And so, except in the worst weather, we always took the risky way. We left our house, went west half a mile, crossed the Fish River, a stream that runs north to join the St. John at Fort Kent, then came up the other side of the Fish River Valley to the stop sign at State Route 11. Here we turned south and ran upstream alongside the Fish, then past Eagle Lake, and then along the west side of the Maine woods. The empty quarter, I call it, the 120 miles to Sherman Station and the interstate, with almost nothing along the way but trees and brooks, the occasional moose, and in summer black flies, invisible until you stop your car and step outside. Instantly, you hear them, see them, feel them buzzing in your hair. The Acadians call them brûleurs, not a bad name, I think, burners. Route 11 was not plowed very often in winter, and it had long, even grades on which you would be stuck if you lost traction. That was the risk, and it explains why people checked the forecast before setting out along the road in winter. Yet, on a deserted night, after a fresh but not impassable snowfall, you could turn off your headlights and drive perfectly well, just by the light of the moon. We were always eager to get back to Fort Kent, to the turnoff that would bring us back across the Fish and home. From Route 11, we looked across the Fish River Valley and saw our house dark and cold in the dead white of the fields. Within an hour, I would have the wood stove roaring and the house comfortably warm. In a strange sense, the scene was and is almost like a photograph. It was an image we held in our minds like a favorite picture in an album. I can see it now. Elsie once told me that in her childhood, and even in her own married youth, husbands almost always left their wives after the potato harvest and went to work in the woods. The wives were cooped up with 8 or 10 children and as many cords of firewood. They had a cellar full of potatoes and buckwheat, and they had countless quarts of canned meat, much of it wild. For greens, everyone relied on canned ferns, the Brookside fiddleheads, that Orny and many of his neighbors still hunted each spring, even in my time. Once or twice each winter, a husband would return home with the family's workhorses, and his wife would finally get a chance to go into town. It was this female isolation in winter, I think, that bred into the St. John Valley women that nervousness that is so characteristic of them. The same isolation perhaps explains why Elsie and the other housewives on our road drove into Fort Kent almost every day regardless of weather, and often with the flimsiest of excuses. None of them had cars more than a couple of years old, and they all drove fast. Elsie remembered when the work of sorting potatoes had been done by hand, by women working in cold potato houses. Cave de patate was the French here. I never heard my neighbors say pomme de terre or even spud. It was always potatoes or the softer-sounding patate. Helped with a bit of rum, a wife worked her way through several hundred barrels of potatoes. That's why Elsie could hardly be dragged to a potato house now, even if only to see seed potatoes being cut mechanically. The potatoes passed over a table with increasingly large perforations. The small potatoes fell through first and would be planted whole. Larger ones were grabbed by spinning wheels and impelled past a knife that cut them in half. The biggest potatoes went to the end of the table, fell through the large holes there, and were cut into 3 pieces by a knife with 3 blades. That wasn't the only thing that had changed on St. John Valley Farms. I think of Orny's older brother Leonard, who, like so many Valley children, had long ago been forced south to make a living. Farms here are not divided with each generation. The son, whom the father judges to be the best farmer, takes the farm over, and everyone else leaves. Once a year, however, Leonard came home from Connecticut for a couple of weeks. Prompted perhaps by Elsie's talk about cutting seed, he told me one day about the numbing boredom of planting potatoes the old way, with a horse-drawn device that was equipped with a bin full of cut seed, coulters to open 2 furrows, and tubes leading to each. Hour after hour, he said, you rhythmically picked up a piece of seed and dropped it into a tube through which it fell into an open furrow. There was no nostalgia in his voice. Out of curiosity, I once stopped in at the State Archives in Augusta to dig up the earliest census reports I could find for the farm. I think it was the 1880 census, and the returns in manuscript were difficult to read, but here was the farm, the family name gave it away, and here were potatoes, 10 acres of them, along with suspiciously equal amounts of buckwheat, rye, barley, wheat, and oats. There were some cows, some sheep, some chickens, some apples. The cows were still around, of course, and so were a couple of ancient apple trees. They were transparents, and still gave good apples, though some main branches had been broken and lay recumbent on the ground. Orny grew about 100 acres of potatoes, about the minimum needed to break even these days. He grew an equal amount of rotation crops, usually oats, but occasionally a crop of beautifully red-stemmed buckwheat. Everything else was gone, chickens and sheep, rye, barley, wheat. Wheat in particular, nobody in Aroostook County had grown for a long time. Things had been changing even in the pioneer times of Orny's great-great-grandfather. In New Brunswick, after all, you see long, thin farms laid out like wooden tongue depressors with one narrow end touching a river. When the river frontage was all taken up, the settlers laid out a second rank or row of farms, stepped back and separated from the first by a road. You still see 3 or 4 ranks of farms set back this way in the hills around Lake Temiscouata. And the same pattern was established on the American side of the St. John Valley when the Acadians arrived in 1785. It has never been eradicated. The names of the owners haven't changed much either. Daigle, Nadeau, Martin, Pelletier. But here, 7 miles south of the St. John, the pattern of farms did change. Instead of long, narrow lots, the farms were domino-shaped and arranged in a neat paving within a framework of square townships. I don't know exactly why this happened, but state government surveyors demarcated the townships and somebody came along and laid out the lots without regard to drainage or topography or vegetation. Old cadastral maps show how our township, it was called New Canada, was surveyed into several hundred such tidy rectangles. And so Orny's great-great-grandfather found himself on a lot that was almost bisected by a maple-covered hill. He put his house along the south edge of the lot, close to the road, and his fields wound up in 2 blocks, one on either side of the hill. It was no improvement on the French system. On the warm days of summer, we would go swimming in the Fish River Falls, a few miles upstream from Fort Kent. The falls are rapids, really, where tea-colored water pours over steeply dipping gray shales. We would step in the river below the main drop and be carried swiftly downstream an exciting 50 yards until the water lost its velocity. And most afternoons we would hear a train. The tracks were set back not more than 50 feet from the far side of the river. I would look up in vain. The trees were too thick. I could see nothing moving. All I got was the theme of the engines and the coda of the wheels. This was a branch of the Bangor and Aroostook, the railroad responsible for the greatest change that has come to Aroostook County in the last 100 years. The railroad arrived in 1893, and 30 years later, it was carrying out of Aroostook more potatoes than were being grown in any other county in the United States. It was an amazing turnabout from subsistence agriculture. By 1921, USDA experts praised Aroostook counties for their use of the most up-to-date methods of fertilization, cultivation, spraying, and harvesting. Still, the county's heyday was brief, about a single generation, and it's hardly too much to say that, when it was over, many farmers had nearly worn out their land in an orgy of potato growing. In a way, it's hard to blame them, for prices were cyclical and growers easily trapped into maximizing production of the one crop that was profitable this far north. In the 1920s, the typical Aroostook farmer still used long crop rotations, potatoes 1 year in 4, followed by 3 years of oats and grass. But during the Depression, potatoes sold for 50 cents a 180-pound barrel. The farmers tried a cooperative, but their hopes of stabilizing the market were disappointed, and the co-op soon became nothing more than a farm supply store. Like wheat farmers in the Great Plains today, the Aroostook farmers did the only thing they could to increase their cash. They grew potatoes 1 year in 3, 1 year in 2. Many grew potatoes year after year for a decade or more. World War II brought high potato prices and the all-time production peak for Aroostook, 150,000 acres of potatoes, grown by 3,000 farmers. These were good times, but Soil Conservation Service experts reported that rotations are very short, generally consisting of 1 year of potatoes and 1 year of crimson clover. Organic matter was being lost, they said. Erosion was increasing. Things were so bad that the Soil Conservation Service chose Central Aroostook as one of a dozen demonstration sites around the country, one of the places where erosion control was most urgently needed. In 1940, the agency's experts wrote that if soil losses continue at the present rate, crop yields are bound to decline in spite of heavy fertilization. Rock outcrops were already appearing in the fields, the same rock that forms the Fish River Falls. Then came Idaho. I was born in that state and will say nothing against it. The Snake River Plains in the southern part of the state are level, and they are blessed with deep volcanic soils and a growing season that is long enough not only for the round white potatoes grown in Aroostook, but for premium russets, which are preferred not only as bakers, but for French fries. Idaho does have a problem with inadequate water, but the American taxpayer has solved that problem by subsidizing irrigation projects like the Minidoka, which irrigates the fields around Twin Falls, where I was born. Idaho's crop was half as big as Aroostook's in 1930. The Idaho crop overtook Aroostook's in 1960 and is now about 7 times as large. Thanks to the Bureau of Reclamation's Columbia Basin Project, even Washington State now has a crop 3 times or more as big as Maine's. For a while, when the U.S. Corps of Engineers was investigating the possibility of building a huge dam upstream from Fort Kent on the St. John, there was talk of an irrigation pipeline to supplement the erratic Aroostook rains, but this was the 1970s. Irrigation had lost its mystique, and the pipeline and the dam itself finally vanished like a Cheshire cat, leaving only a smile basking on government document bookshelves. The Aroostook farmers welcomed the manufacturers of French fries, but processing plants need lots of clean water, and the Aroostook River down by Caribou was soon fully burdened with processing plant effluent. Besides, potatoes weren't big enough. Sugar beets were tried. I remember touring a magnificent and federally subsidized mill east of Presque Isle. A few years later it was closed, with incriminations from all sides. The mill was taken apart, German bit by German bit, and reassembled somewhere in Quebec. In 1976, potatoes hit $15 a barrel, with heavy exports to Europe. The next year, Europe had a good crop, and at least some Aroostook farmers hauled their potatoes to the dump. In a way, it was their own fault, because they had abandoned their traditional domestic customers. They now found that those customers preferred to stick with the Western suppliers they had turned to the year before. Since 1945, the county's potato acreage has fallen by about two-thirds, from 150,000 to 50,000 acres. In a way, cropland retirement is probably the best thing that could have happened to the county's overused fields, many of which are now so shallow that farm implements break each year on rock outcrops. But it is one thing to advocate retirement in principle. It is another to advocate it in a real community. Practically overnight, rumors about people losing their farms materialized as accomplished facts. In the wink of an eye, there was some paperwork at the bank and the county courthouse. The next thing you knew, a man who had been a farmer was working at a job in town or trying to get one. He usually continued to own his house and an acre of ground. The rest was taken over by somebody else, probably a neighbor. The best fields stayed in cultivation. The rest went to pasture or all the way back to forest. The most dramatic case I knew of concerned Tommy Lachance, who had bought out a group of farms covering several thousand acres in Dagle, the township to our south. I never saw him. I just saw his two-engine plane, which often sat next to the airstrip he had bladed out in the middle of the vast and level forest opening that was his farm. He used the plane to go back and forth between Maine and another operation he had on Long Island, I think. I never paid much attention to Lachance, but after leaving Maine I heard from friends that he had gone out of business, after one particularly bad year. People didn't put it that way, of course. They said Lachance had lost his farm. How Lachance handled the blow I don't know, but I remember smaller men whose smiles shrank to one side of their faces. They took pills for their heart. They felt that they had failed the generations of their name. The miracle really is that farmers like Orony survived. Much of the credit was Elsie's, for she was a fiscal monk, refusing to buy anything on credit. Everything from tractors to snowmobiles waited until there was cash in hand to buy it outright. Most of the farm equipment that Orony bought was already used, picked up at an auction that nobody wanted to talk about. Orony owed his survival as well to the most tenacious kind of land husbandry. He had places in his fields where beds of shale, he called it ledge, lay only a few inches below the surface. The soil upon that rock was nothing but a veneer of weathered glacial till, fearfully erodible early and late in the crop year when the ground was unprotected by vegetation or snow. That's why Orony farmed on the contour, even though doing so has become increasingly unpopular as farm machinery grows larger and larger and more difficult to steer around tight curves. He rotated his fields without fail, even though oats and buckwheat don't pay, unless you factor in the higher potato yields that come with rotation. I don't think Orony did any such factoring. It became commonplace only after we left Maine, when the Soil Conservation Service, despairing of farmers who abandoned contour planting, began publicizing the long-term economic benefit of rotation crops. Orony rotated out of a more primitive, instinctive sense of what was proper. We had another neighbor who showed me how strong that land-caring instinct could be. His name was Wilfred, and he was physically smaller than Orony, less outgoing, pinched a bit. But I remember an afternoon shower that washed out one of his freshly planted fields. Seed was scattered everywhere, and the roadside ditch was filled with sediment that had washed in from gullies that lay across the field in branching patterns like the shadows of dead maples. Wilfred went out and replanted, of course, but what was remarkable was that, at the end of the season, he hired a loader and dump truck, put the soil back up at the top of his field, and smoothed it out with his own geriatric bulldozer. It was like something out of Asia or Germany. It was almost un-American. Both Orny and Wilfred were lucky that New Canada is situated on the northwestern edge of the potato-growing part of Aroostook County. Because of that, they were able to specialize in growing high-priced seed potatoes rather than table stock or potatoes for processing. For seed potatoes must be free of viral disease, for which there is no cure. The only solution is to farm in a remote spot and avoid infection in the first place. Remote we were. Still, Wilfred put keep out signs around the fields where he planted his first-generation seed, in the same way I remember asking Orny one day where he had planted his first-generation potatoes. He told me, but it was the only time a question of mine ever made him uncomfortable, and when I walked up to look at the innocent rows, I kept my distance. A short time earlier, I had visited the Porter farm, where the state produces the potatoes sold to commercial seed growers like Orny and Wilfred. It, too, was on the edge of the cultivated area, but farther south, west of Presque Isle. It was surrounded by forest. A sign at the entrance instructed visitors to drive through the disinfectant pool. Shoes had to be treated, too. Looking back at the farmers I knew here, I see not the roller coaster of prices and production in Aroostook, but something more fixed, something with the permanence of a constellation. It's odd, really, because I know that farming had changed in Orny's and Wilfred's lifetimes. Both had adopted new kinds of equipment. Both used chemicals in quantity. Both were alert for better ways of farming. Yet these changes were made for the most conservative of reasons. Neither man had an eye to building a fortune, or getting ahead, or becoming an agribusinessman. In May, both of them got to work with an energy that I do not think I can distinguish from the force that drove the sap that rose in the hilltop maples. The first rains had come by then, music after months of noiseless snow. Our single-lane road and the roof of our house had turned black again, and the eaves dripped continually into piles of mushy snow. Houseflies appeared, sluggishly basking on southern walls. The fields were mostly bare mud, so slippery that walking up even the slightest grade was almost impossible, yet Wilfred couldn't resist. He took his old bulldozer out and broke up the last drifts to speed his field's drainage. A couple of weeks later, I would be awakened by the sound of potato planters. It wasn't the first machinery of the season. Tractors had already combed the fields with harrows, but the planters were ingenious machines adapted from modern corn planters. They had two bins that funneled seed close to the ground. Discs rotated near the bottom of each bin. Each disc had holes in its face, and a spring-mounted spike snapped through each hole to impale a bit of potato and bring it down to the furrow. The spike then withdrew through the disc and left the seed on its own in the ground with the dose of fertilizer. The blade covered the furrow over, and the planter moved on slowly, noisily clicking as the spikes snapped. It was a distinctive sound, mechanical in a world of silent electronics, pleasantly slow in a world of blizzarding digits. Orny's planting, I would say, meaning that I wanted Margaret to enjoy the sound too. A few weeks later, Orny and Wilfred had to start walking their potato rows to pull out the very occasional plant infected with viral disease. It's a peculiarity of the disease that it's visible only in cool climates. That's why growers all over the country buy seed from northern producers, either in Maine or in places like Minnesota. The potatoes had to be hilled, too, lest the sun burn them. A day would come, I never anticipated it with any accuracy, when Orny would be out at the barn looking over his ears, the hilling implement that resembled a small plow with opposing mold boards. The potatoes now began to look like something. I'd drive by, squint, and imagine that I was looking at a citrus orchard with heavy green rows of trees marching along. These were the weeks when the rains could fail. One year, Margaret and I came back from a short vacation and found Wilfred and Orny in somber conversation. The potatoes were black and limp. I thought that some disease was to blame, but I didn't want to interrupt them. Later, I asked Orny. It wasn't a disease, there simply hadn't been any rain. Elsie's vegetable garden could be kept alive with occasional dousings from the tank truck, but the potato fields were too big for that. The farmers had decided to pray for rain. They would hold a special mass in Orny's potato house. Such a thing would never be approved by the local priest, I thought, but I was wrong. A couple of days later, I went down to the potato house, a building that was hardly more than a concrete slab under a roof and four walls. Orny and a couple of his sons were scrubbing away the musty smell of last year's potatoes, which had either been shipped south some months earlier or planted in Orny's own fields. An altar was being improvised with planks supported by potato barrels. On it, displays of potatoes were set out in baskets made of ash, sturdy baskets with a slightly flexing handle. Elsie had cut a few handfuls of this year's oats, still green, and had tacked them to the wall like fleur-de-lis. About 20 farmers and their wives came to the service, which was simple and brief. For the next day or so I kept an eye on the sky. So far as I could tell, nobody talked about rain or complained when it did not come. But rain did come, after I had given up waiting, but soon enough to save the crop. There were a few days each summer when Boston's mugginess drifted up, but most days were warm and clear with cool nights. It was a good time to go fishing, and Orny would take his homemade trailer out to the empty quarter and come back with landlocked salmon. Fried fish was a lunchtime staple throughout the year, along with red meat, salad, and of course potatoes. The potatoes were princely, but they were never baked. Mashed was the rule, and invariably peeled. What Elsie thought of Margaret for mashing unpeeled potatoes she kept to herself. The only field work to be done now was spraying for blight. Every 10 days, somebody went through the fields with a tractor pulling a tank car fitted with booms that reached out and laid down a swath of clear spray. Most Americans have learned to disapprove of such things, but I always watched the spraying and thought about Ireland. And what a difference spraying would have made there. The chemical that even the farmers hated came a bit later. This was the top kill, applied in August. It was a necessity, because the arustic frost-free season is about 100 days. Round white potatoes need about 90 to mature, plus 2 weeks to harden before they can withstand the rough handling of harvest. If a farmer waits for the crop to die naturally, he risks losing it to a killing frost. Early in this century, arustic farmers began top-killing with sulfuric acid, but years ago they switched to general herbicides, bought by the barrel. Every farmer I knew had horror stories about the stuff. All of them had felt sick from it at one time or another, and their fastidious wives complained about the ineradicable stains it left in clothing. The herbicide's effect on potatoes, of course, was devastating. The colloquial expression was that the fields had been burned. They certainly looked it. Within a week, the miniature orchards were gone. The ground was bare, with flaccid tangles of old stems, black, torched. The oats and buckwheat had already been harvested with ancient combines whose continued operation amazed me. The winds were already cold. They had turned with an amazing snap. One day and summer was over. Everyone knew it. The hardwoods were turning magnificently, especially the sugar maples on top of the hill behind the barn. I used to wander up there, kicking dead leaves and stopping at the bases of the big maples to lean against them and listen to the silence. Mechanical harvesters were introduced in the late 1950s, and by 1970 almost every farmer in Aroostook had one. The great advantage of the machines, with headlights of course, is that they can work at night. This is tremendously important in a place where farmers continually worry about a killing freeze. And so it was that when I drove through Aroostook at night during harvest, I saw what looked like brightly lit yachts moving slowly across a gently rolling sea. Some of the harvesters were self-propelled. Others were pulled by tractors. In either case, they were big machines digging 2 rows of potatoes and bringing them by conveyors to a sorting table where a crew tossed culls and rocks aside. The potatoes continued by a conveyor to an arm, from which they were dumped into a truck crawling alongside. As soon as the truck was filled, it took off for a potato house and was replaced by an empty truck. This was dangerous work. Arms were often broken, partly because the sorters got so cold, standing all day on a platform that kept jouncing along as it moved. Nobody liked working on these machines. And here again was tenacity, for Wilfred insisted each year upon harvesting one field by hand. Margaret asked him why, and his answer makes me almost bless Wilfred's taciturn soul. He said he liked the way it looked. That was all he said. He couldn't carry off the operation with historical exactitude because he didn't have any horses to pull the potato digger, but he had a digger, which he pulled with a tractor. Lines of potatoes were brought to the surface and old barrels were scattered over the field. Heaven knows how Wilfred had managed to keep those ancient things. Orny only had a dozen or so lying around. Wilfred had to get a picking crew, too. The St. John Valley schools still closed in late September and early October so that children could help with this traditional task. Few children did, for a few farmers needed hand pickers, but Wilfred found 2 or 3 dozen willing youngsters, and each was given a sturdy basket, like those used in the Mass to bring rain. Each child took a row and marched along on hands and knees, filling the basket over and over and dumping it into one of the scattered barrels. Each child had a pocket full of numbered tickets, which were put in his barrels or her barrels as they were filled. Wilfred came by, picked up the barrels, pocketed the tickets, and at day's end paid each child by the barrel filled. The weather was as cold as it was for the people working on mechanical harvesters, but everybody here moved a lot more, kept their arms unbroken, and had a good time. By this time in the season, there were 6 or 8 cords of firewood tucked into our basement, enough within our solid walls to keep the house warm all winter with one good wood-burning stove. Smooth-barked beech was the best, 8 inches in diameter, 20 in length, heavy, and $35 a cord, dumped at the side of the house. I would get up in the morning, get a few logs from the basement, stoke the stove, and heat up the house in half an hour except for the bathroom. Later on, I might go for a walk up the hill, look west toward the empty quarter, and shiver a bit, as much from the sight of the cold and bare soil of the fields as from the air itself. Deer season came and went, the one time of the year when I was careful to stay out of the woods. Moose in those years were still fully protected. One walked into the vegetable garden next to our house and looked up in boredom as the tempted Orny handed me a rifle. I knew the local warden, a man named McPhee, and I didn't want to tangle with him. I didn't want to kill the moose either. She ignored us and eventually drifted off, walking on legs that looked like stilts she wasn't quite used to. We waited for winter. The rule of thumb was snow by Thanksgiving, permanent snow for the duration. Sometimes Thanksgiving passed with the ground still umber, frozen, sullen, I thought, but heavy snows did come, usually on calm and not very cold nights. You could go outside lightly dressed, lie down as the flakes buried you, and stay warm for a long time. The flakes muffled the air and silenced even the sounds coming from the nearby house. Later on, the winds would come, the violent weather, that kept you inside, that built 10-foot drifts in a couple of hours, that made you appreciate walls that weren't going anywhere. In blizzards, when you could see nothing unless you looked straight up, the snowplows worked all night. They were just dump trucks, fitted with a blade and loaded with sand that they sprinkled behind them like a defecating hippopotamus. The plows pushed the snow to the side until, after a half-dozen storms, the banks rose 5 or 6 feet. A payloader then worked its way along, laboriously pushing the banks back so the process could begin again. On those blizzard nights, the rumble of the heavy blade on the ice always woke us, for there was hardly more than 10 feet between our pillows and the pavement. All the old houses were built that way. Farther from the road just meant more snowshoeing or shoveling in winter. The sound grew louder until the whole house shook. No rattling, just vibrations. We woke up and thought that the plow would surely burst through the wall and kill us. But the driver had grown up with these winter nights, was perfectly at ease in them, even welcomed them, and so the truck would pass, a little Doppler effect in its wake, and the wind would quickly pick up the sound of the blade and carry it away to the south. We'd drift back to sleep. I remember the reflection on the plow's rooftop light, winking a fainter and fainter yellow in the window. I don't think I've ever felt more secure.